Animal intelligence. As you know, with Event Horizon and my original channel, I am keenly interested in astrobiology and the potential for alien life. And if we ever do detect life elsewhere in the universe, then how do we find out what it is like? How do we communicate with it? A good place to start is life on Earth that isn't human, and trying to figure out how animals, like the octopuses and dolphins, non-terrestrial intelligent life by definition, think, and constitute a natural place to start in addition to learning more about the species that share this planet with us. My guest today has been involved for over 4 decades in the study of dolphin and animal intelligence and trying to answer some of those questions to often surprising results. Remarkable results, really. An interesting conversation in the course of her career with encounters with Star Trek IV and director Leonard Nimoy. The movie asked a fun question. What happens if aliens come and don't want to talk to us, but rather someone else here? And cross-disciplinary work with SETI and Frank Drake, who famously dubbed one of the first scientific meetings in SETI the Order of the Dolphin. I hope you enjoy this episode. It's a little different, but still related to astrophysics.
You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Diana Reiss. Dr. Diana Reiss serves as a professor in the Department of Psychology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is a cognitive psychologist and marine mammal scientist, renowned for her pioneering research on dolphin intelligence and communication. She has extensively studied mirror self-recognition in dolphins, demonstrating their capacity for self-awareness. She has advocated for marine mammal conservation and ethical treatment, working to raise awareness about the intelligence and complex social lives of these animals.
Dr. Diana Reiss, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Now, Doctor, you are one of the pioneers of trying to figure out what dolphin communication is and how to begin to communicate with them, which they honestly seem to understand us more than we understand them in a lot of cases.
I agree.
They're not only intuitive, but they're empathetic. And we see these things that we see in some other animals, but they're very pronounced in the dolphin. Now, as we were trying to figure out things like, what is this very interestingly human-like, almost human analog brain, a little bit different brain to body mass, how does that play into cognition? Meaning that, what is the correlation between body mass and brain size, number one, and two, how is it in a dolphin as compared to a human?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So, interestingly, dolphins have the second largest brain mass to body mass next to humans. That's kind of a wow factor. So, in other words, what that's called the encephalization quotient. It's a mouthful, or the short version is EQ. And again, that's the ratio between basically brain mass and body mass, brain size and body size. And as humans, our brain is about 7 times as large as it needs to be, larger than it needs to be to run a body of our size. Dolphin brains are the next closest, the next largest relative to their body size. Their brain is about 4.2 or 4.3 times the size. Apes, our closest relatives, are about 2.3 times the size. Elephants come in around where apes are. So do parrots, like African gray parrots that many have heard about, who've learned referential communication from Dr. Irene Pepperberg's groundbreaking work. So again, this is one measure of intelligence. We really don't know the recipe for intelligence, though, when you think about it, whether it's the architecture of the brain, whether it's the size of the brain relative to the body, the complexity of the brain. But when we look at these species that have really large brains compared to their body size, it seems to correlate with more complex behavior and problem-solving abilities and things like that, or intelligence.
Now, differences in brain physiology, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but dolphins can't smell, and they don't really have, or at least not as we would recognize it, meaning they wouldn't have all the olfactory understanding and things like that that a human brain has. Yet the dolphin has more brain. In other words, so what does it use the other stuff for? For example, something most animals don't have, sonar. What's a sonar part of the brain look like? How big is this?
Yeah.
This type of structure within physiology of a dolphin brain.
Yeah, well, sonar involves hearing. Obviously, these animals are putting out wide band of clicks. And when they send out this series of clicks, the reflected echoes coming back from what they're hitting give them what we think is an acoustic picture, much like if you did imaging on looking at a part of your body with imaging devices. But there are bats that also use very sophisticated sonar and a few other animals, and their brains are not very big. So most of us don't think that it's the echolocation processing that's driving this big brain. There's this idea that animals that live in complex societies have larger brains because they need it to track others, to live in these complex worlds, and then face and solve the problems they meet in these societies. This is the social brain hypothesis. They're clearly intelligent animals that may not be considered social, like the octopus, that also seems to be very intelligent. So brain capacity and intelligence can evolve in non-social animals, it seems, as well as highly social. There are parts of the dolphin brain is very complex and it's very large. They have huge acoustic processing areas in their brain. They don't have an organized frontal lobe that we can find like we have in a human brain. They have visual areas, they have acoustic areas. They don't, as you said, process olfactory or smell information. We think that they may not taste, they don't have the kinds of taste buds we have, but they seem to sense texture and saltiness, which makes a lot of sense living in an aquatic environment. They are intelligent and highly intelligent animals. And I'm often just amazed at the kinds of things that you learn from them and that I've learned from them when you're living up close and personal with them. And I'd love to tell you some more of those encounters.
Well, I'm going to ask about one, in fact, because you say texture, which the first thing that popped into my mind was a fishtail. And you told an account of working with a dolphin where you were cutting fish in thirds, and the dolphin was okay with the head and the center section, but the tail, not so much, perhaps not great texture. And it would be interesting to see if they leave that part alone when they feed on fish in nature. But this dolphin then went on to exhibit a social behavior. That's what I'll say. Exhibit a social behavior towards you. Tell us the story.
Yeah, I call this my first close encounter with the non-terrestrial mind, still playing on that theme. And when I was a graduate student outside of Paris at that point, and actually was in the south of France, and I was working with this very wonderful young dolphin named Circe, and I was asked to feed her fish. And again, the fish, as you described, I won't go into too much detail now because you've told most of the story, which I'm happy to hear you know this. So I was giving Circe these very large mackerel, and they were, again, about 3 times the width of her head. And I decided to cut them up into smaller sections. So she readily ate the heads, she ate the middles, she spit out all the tails. So I learned to cut off the little tail fin at the end. And as soon as I did that, she would readily eat these tail sections, again, as long as I cut it properly and the tail fins were off. Now, at the same time, I was teaching Circe to stop when I was feeding her. And that meant when I put a bucket on the side of the pool, she should stop in front of me and wait until the feeding was over. And then I would give her a terminate signal. And at one point, everything was going really well. I was using this, what I call a timeout, to correct her if she didn't stay at poolside with me. It was my only way of communicating with her because we didn't have a shared code at that point. So the timeout was basically me backing away from the pool about 5 to 10 feet. I would stay away for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then I would come back. And that taught her, don't leave unless the feeding is over. And she was smart. She learned really quickly. Everything was going great. Circe's eating all the parts of the fish, including the cut tails. And it was a few weeks later. And then at one point, I erroneously gave her an uncut tail. And Circe looked up at me, and she kind of looked at me with this odd look, and she made a beeline to the other side of the pool, took a vertical position, and just stayed there and stared at me. Now, this is a really bizarre thing. And I'm looking at this. She's never done this before. And I was there with a young student who was working with me, and we both were looking at each other thinking, is it possible she's giving me a timeout? It was exactly the same behavior I had done to correct her. Is she correcting me? And I couldn't, and then she eventually came back and finished eating, and I was lucky I had cut all the tails properly. But it really struck me, this is quite remarkable if she's now starting to use that signal back on me. But that's an anecdote. And as a scientist, there wasn't much I could say about that. Maybe it was something significant, maybe it wasn't. But I decided to turn it into an experiment. It actually became a chapter in my PhD thesis, the unexpected chapter, probably the best one in the whole thesis, actually. But what I did is I waited, and then I waited a few days, and then I purposely gave her another uncut tail during one of the feeds. And she did the same thing again, went across the pool and waited. I did it on 3 occasions altogether, and each time she did it. And it really I found it extremely compelling. Again, at that point, I realized that these were magnificent minds, and it really drove me even more passionately into doing this research that I've been doing for about 40 years with these animals. And we still don't understand that much.
You know how you could say this is in a sort of chilling way, because not only were you watching the dolphin was watching you. In other words, you were studying each other, perhaps even scientifically.
I think that large-brained animals, and even animals that don't have giant brains, learn. They have to learn about what happens and when. I call it the contingencies. They're learning contingencies. Other species like us live or die by being able to predict things and be able to solve problems and use past information. And I think this was a beautiful example of this. And I think about dolphins as my partners. It may be a different way than other people talk about the species or the individuals they work with, but each of them is different. They all have different personalities, and it's not a crime or being anthropomorphic to say that anymore. We can use the term personality to talk about behavioral differences. It's part of what we do as scientists now. And the way I think we think about animals is changing, and it's changing rapidly. You know, we used to think they were non-thinking creatures, that we were the only creatures on this planet that were thinking. I mean, it's hard to believe we ever felt that way. This debate has been going on since the 4th century in terms of anything that's, historically known. But you learn so much when you watch the behavior of bees that have far fewer neurons, and they're doing complex things. And all the way, through other species, it's really humbling in many ways.
It's also extraordinarily beautiful to see it, because it tells you about the greater concern here, which is evolution and evolutionary processes, and how they can, that unthinking process of life on Earth evolving and changing and developing can produce so much complexity that it's not even funny. And it only appears to get even more complex the more we learn, because now we know that dolphins are thinking and they're learning. Now, in regards to the upbringing of a dolphin, a juvenile dolphin in nature, is it the type of animal that basically has to learn everything from its parent or its pod, for this, in this case, or does it have instinct, or is it like a human where it just has to learn everything, which predisposes it to learning all the way through, perhaps?
Yeah, well, that's really a great question. We studied dolphins from birth through the first year, and then onward from that in a lab I was working with in California. I've worked in aquaria where I feel like I can watch them up close and personally, and then also in the field. And when we do work in aquaria, I try to work with them in ways that will enrich their lives, giving them things that they can manipulate, keyboards and mirrors. But I will address your question very specifically, because we had the good fortune to watch how echolocation develops, and also how their behavior develops over the first years and second years, third years, through the 5th or 6th year of life. And what you see is, like us, they're learning. They learn through observation. Now, when they're born, most young dolphins sort of hit the water swimming. They seem to have a pretty good instinct for how to move their bodies and swim. There may be young dolphins that need a little pushing up from their mothers in the beginning, and you see that, but often they're right off their swimming. They're breathing. They are what are called voluntary breathers. They have to think to breathe. It doesn't happen involuntarily like we do. So they're there. They have much smaller lungs, so they take more breaths per minute than their moms. We actually saw one mother named Terry, that we call Terry, actually seemed to adjust the rate of breathing of her male offspring to get it to be a little bit closer, not as infrequent as the mom was doing, but she would put her beak, the pointy part of her head, over the baby's blowhole, over the calf's blowhole after several hours and try to get it looked like she was trying to adjust his breathing rate. I've only seen that in one dolphin, but they learn, they watch the others. And even what's really interesting is we've seen that in several groups, young females that have not observed other females mothering techniques may not know what to do. You see that we've seen this in gorillas as well. They have to see a model mother to know what to do. It's not instinctive. And it's really interesting to see. We had 2 calves born in our facility at a place called Marine World, Africa, USA, in south of San Francisco. And we watched an experienced mother just sort of go ahead and do all the right things, adjusting and caring for her calf. And the second mother just followed her. She gave birth 2 days later, and you would watch. She would do what the other mother was doing. It was quite interesting. I'll just make another note that they also show behaviors like us. They do what's called anteing. So one mother may care for 2 offspring while the other mother goes off and rests. And we've seen evidence for that in the wild, where an older female or a related female will care for younger animals. You see this with elephants as well. Also, another large-brained, highly social species. There are a lot of similarities between elephants and what we see with dolphins in offspring rearing or child rearing.
In other words, babysitting is an example of convergent evolution.
Babysitting is a good solution. Yeah, I'll just mention this because we got a real kick out of this. When the calves are named, or what we call the young offspring of dolphins. But when the calves were just 11 months old, they were with their moms. They stay with their moms until they're 3, and we never actually even separated them. But we introduced an underwater keyboard to them to give them choice and control. I think this was the first study that ever tried to do this. And it was quite interesting. People have trained dolphins to study their behavior. And my approach has been, no, I don't think I want to train these big brains. I'd rather observe them and give them opportunities to show us their capabilities and let them interact with systems and see what will they do if they have an underwater keyboard where they can ask for things, and a keyboard that if they hit a triangular shape when it's on one of 9 positions on an underwater keyboard and it makes a sound like, and that gets them a ball in their pool. Or if they hit an H-shaped visual symbol and they hear a different whistle and they get a tickle from us, or they hear a different kind of sound that gets them a ring. These were things that they seemed to enjoy. And what we found was that these 2 calves, again, they were 11 months old when we started. We had studied their own vocal development, how their own whistles develop, and we studied how their echolocation develops. And now we wanted to see what would happen if we introduced these calves with their mothers in the pool, of course, to this. And it was really hysterical. It was the first time the mothers allowed the calves to be on their own. I joke that it served as a babysitting device for the mothers. The mothers could go off and rest, and they didn't use it. The calves were the ones who were interacting with it. So I think that was perhaps enriching for the mothers as well. But in this keyboard study, what we learned was, first, they were very interested in interacting with it, but they did so much more than we anticipated. All of the computer synthesized whistles were within the the acoustic hearing range and the vocal production range of the dolphin's normal signals. But they were different in the shape, in what they sounded like. or what we call contour. That's how frequencies change over time. So my very poor renditions of those, you would see them looking like different shapes if I put them on a paper for you, or made what we call a sonogram, a sound picture. And what they started doing was imitating the sounds after very few exposures. So after just 19 times that they heard the ball whistle, they did beautiful imitations of ball. And the same thing with ring. I think it was after 9 imitations with ring. I forget what the numbers were now, but after very few times hearing it, it was much like we saw with young children. They even showed what we call the recency and primacy effect, where they imitated the very end of the ball whistle first, analogous to a young baby learning the word banana and saying nana, the part they just heard. The very next time they imitated the beginning of ball, like saying banana, and then the next time they put it all together until the whole whistle for ball was whistled. So we learned a lot about their vocal learning processes, but they did more. They actually started using these signals in productive ways, not just imitating them, but using them in a behaviorally appropriate contexts. So we would see them, we would record them whistling the ball whistle as they're approaching or playing with the ball. Same thing with ring. And with rub, for example, they would whistle the rub sound, sometimes even when they would rub my hand, whistle rub, and produce that whistle. And it was quite interesting. They started using that in their own repertoire. So that was a very exciting and probably my favorite study that we've ever done.
Now, how long ago was that? When was that done?
Okay, so this was a long time ago. We started it in 1984 and we ran it through 1986. We couldn't work with them for about a 2-year break because we moved our lab from south of San Francisco to north of San Francisco. Our whole facility moved, Marine World. It was quite interesting because we worked with them for a full year. Then we were not working for about a year to 2 years. I don't remember the exact hiatus. And the first time I came out with the keyboard, after that long period of time that they had never heard the sounds or seen the keyboard, I was walking out to the pool and we recorded one of the dolphins whistling the ball sound.
So it remembered it.
And that really does speak to these, exquisite acoustic minds that they have and memory.
And memory. I mean, they're long-lived, so they apparently have a very long memory. We know the elephants do already.
Yes. Mm-hmm. We're doing another study right now at a place called the Roatan Institute of Marine Sciences in Honduras, in Roatan, Honduras. And we're also looking at memory. We're looking at the dolphins' capability and ways that they can coordinate their behavior when they're asked to do a task that is do something different than you've done before, but do it with a partner. So these two animals have to come up with something that they haven't already done in that session and figure out how to coordinate with their partner. Are they using sound? Is it just follow the leader? We're still in the analysis phase, but one of the doctoral students in our lab is working on that one in this collaborative effort we have.
So you were working at a cetacean institute in San Francisco right about the time that Star Trek, the Voyage Home was in the theaters, right?
Actually, I was contacted about that film. I have a funny story I can relay about this. So the Dolphin Lab was south of San Francisco, and we were just about to move the entire lab to north of San Francisco in Vallejo with Marine World when they moved. And I received a call from Leonard Nimoy's office at the time. And they said, hello, Dr. Reiss, we're doing this. We have a script for a film about, a Star Trek film, and it's about humpbacks in space. And I thought, oh boy. So I said, what is the script about? And they said, we're not completely sure yet where it's going, but one of your colleagues, another marine mammal scientist, had suggested that we call you because you would be a good model for this, because you're a woman working with dolphins, and this is about a woman working with humpbacks. We're wondering whether we could film it at your lab, because this was going to take place in San Francisco. And they were going to use, I think, a green screen, or I think at the time they actually said there was a red screen that they were going to use. I wasn't familiar with that term. And I said, well, I don't think, I'd love to do it, but we can't do it at our lab because we're moving and I don't think it's going to work. But we talked about all of that. And, they were asking me ideas. And I said, well, just make her human, make her really care about these animals, because most of us who work with these animals really do care deeply for them. It's not just scientists who study them. We want to study them and then spread the word about what we're learning so we can get other people feeling empathy and wanting to protect them as well. And I think they did a good job with that, of the person who played that role in that script. But there's a funny other story about this. There are two connected stories. Frank Drake, who was one of the main scientists listening to signals from space. He was one of the heads of the SETI project it was run through NASA, and then they went independent of NASA. Frank Drake was down the road, and I've worked in conjunction with SETI. I wasn't a paid employee. I was an affiliated person who worked with that program. And that's a whole other story. But Frank Drake tells this story that people used to joke about him. He was professor at UC Santa Cruz. And he was also contacted by Leonard Nimoy's office. And he said Leonard Nimoy actually came down to talk with him in his office. Frank joked that people always used to joke that he was talking to little green men, because he was looking at signals from space, with SETI. And he said it was hysterical because there was like a kind of a window in his door. And he said people were looking in his door, and now there's Frank talking to Leonard Nimoy in his office. So it doesn't get much better than that, I think. But the other interesting story connected with Star Trek was that I had never studied humpbacks. I focused my work on bottlenose dolphins. And the week that I got the call from Star Trek, it was, I believe, later that week that I got a call that a humpback whale had come in to San Francisco Bay. And I was also working with the California Marine Mammal Stranding Group. It was a rehab and rescue facility, and I was a science advisor for them. And we would bring stranded dolphins to our facility, and they would be in an isolated pool so we could help rehab them and then hopefully release them again. I got a call from the director just after I got the call from Star Trek. It was that same week or close to it, that a humpback whale had wandered into San Francisco Bay. Would I come out and help with the rescue? And I said, I would, but we were moving all the dolphins and animals that week. I would join them the next week. And it was that very next week that I actually was involved in the rescue of a very large humpback whale we named Humphrey, which kind of made worldwide news. He wandered into San Francisco Bay, went upstream all the way up through to close to Sacramento. And I was charged. This was a government operation working with our rescue group, and we monitored him. And it's a long story, but the highlight for me was that we had to figure a way to get him out of the bay. And I became the head of what was called the playback operation. We had decided collectively to play back sounds of humpbacks feeding in Alaskan waters that we were sent, that had been recorded by other colleagues. And we were sent these signals, and then I was to figure out how to do this. So I conducted this playback I was in charge of this playback operation. And it was quite remarkable. The whale came directly to our boat and followed us the first day for 6 to 8 hours. And it was basically just remarkable how the whale, if this whale started moving away from the boat, I would just play these sounds and he'd just come right back to the boat. And then I'd stop playing the sounds until he started drifting, and then I'd play them. It was just like calling your dog back. And the reason I'm saying this is because, again, I had never worked with a humpback, and there are lots of details. I have a book called Dolphin in the Mirror, where the opening chapter tells the details of this rescue, if anybody's interested. But at the very end, we were able to lead him back out through Golden Gate Bay, a bridge into the bay. And we had a flotilla of boats around us. We had government boats, we had Coast Guard boats, we had these smaller boats that were used in the Vietnam War. And then we had a flotilla of very small boats like the ones we were doing the one we did the playback from. And when we got out of the Golden Gate Bridge area, we were hoping that Humphrey would head south because he was on a southern migration at that time, and he just made the wrong turn into San Francisco Bay. And he went the wrong way again. He went north. So I asked everyone just to make everybody made a bullseye around our boat. And we said we had everybody turn off their boat motors and just listen. And we had pulled up our speaker long before that. We were the only boat. We were the boat in the middle. And we didn't see Humphrey for many minutes. And we thought we had lost him and he had just gone the wrong way again. And then suddenly he popped up, but he was right next to our boat. He didn't come up near any of the other boats except our boat. And he pressed his belly, his ventral side, against our boat and just looked up at us. And I can't tell you, it was a remarkable experience. There was not a dry eye on the boat. And we all kind of lost it. And, we were scientists, but we all trying to be, rational about this. But we all felt that he had come to sort of go, thanks, and acknowledged our boat. Now, and then he went off in the right direction, finally. Now, you might ask, did he really know? Why did he pick your boat out? Was he really coming back for something? And at that time, we didn't know much about humpbacks in terms of their behavior. We knew they sung beautiful songs. Roger Payne and his wife, Katie Payne, had talked about these fabulously, hauntingly beautiful songs humpbacks do. And there's been lots of research on that. But in recent years, we've learned that humpbacks may actually show empathy, and they may actually get in between orcas that are preying upon seals and other even smaller cetaceans, and come between them and show perhaps behavior that we might consider empathic. So it really does make you wonder, do they really understand caregiving and that kind of altruistic behavior? So it's still a question, but it was just remarkable experience.
Now, back to your book, The Dolphin in the Mirror. Now, that's an interesting title because it evokes the mirror test. And dolphins are one of the handful of species that very clearly know that's that's themselves in that mirror. And you can do the experiments like the marking and all that stuff to determine that. Tell us about your experiences with dealing with dolphins watching themselves in the mirrors. And I've seen footage of this, and it's amazing some of the weird moves they make while they're watching themselves because they know they're watching themselves.
Yeah. So, before we did the study, we thought we were the only species that had the cognitive capacity to understand that that was our external image and to use a mirror as a tool. And then Gordon Gallup and other colleagues showed it with our closest relatives, the great apes. It doesn't seem that monkeys, unless they're in really unusual situations or they're trained to do so, will show it. And people think that this capacity may be linked with not only self-awareness, but social awareness and also empathy. And what's curious is that dolphins were a perfect candidate to do this study with. I mean, Gallup, who had first done the other study, suggested dolphins and elephants because they were large-brained, highly social mammals that also showed empathy. And those two species, my colleagues and I showed, we did those studies with both dolphins and elephants, and indeed they both showed it. But when you watch a dolphin in a mirror, again, if they echolocate off a mirror, they don't get anything back from it. It just bounces off. And what you see is the same striking progression of behaviors or stages of behaviors that humans and apes show, dolphins and elephants show. First in front of a mirror, they act like they're seeing another of their own species. They show social behavior. And different dolphins respond differently, but that behavior, if they've seen reflectivity before and they know something about reflectivity, they may not show any social behavior. We've seen that in dolphins in some aquariums where they've had highly reflective walls. But for those that are really mirror naive, they'll show some social behavior at the beginning. They may try to echolocate or whistle, and then that subsides, and you see it changing into what we call contingency testing behavior. And that we talk about that as sort of very unusual and repetitive behaviors at the mirror. It's like if you walk into a pharmacy or a store that has a monitor above, and you can see people walking into the front door. Often, to see if that's you, if you're coming in with a group of people, you might move your head in a repeated way or wave your hand to see if that's you're seeing in that monitor. It shows you that that's you. You're seeing a one-to-one relationship. And we've seen that in apes, in humans, in dolphins, in elephants. You see them go through this contingency testing. And if you've ever seen the Groucho Marx or Lucille Ball skits where they do this kind of strange movement in front of a mirror. It was a very popular skit that they did. I often use these in public talks I give. You'll see with Groucho or is looking and doing sort of hopping back and forth in front of a mirror, or skipping in front of the mirror to see, is that guy doing the same thing? And dolphins will do that, and as elephants and apes do, as humans do. And that's where I think the light bulb goes on, that light goes on, that aha moment hits them. That's me in the mirror. And then they shift into this next phase of behavior, which is self-directed. They're directing their own behavior. They're looking at themselves in the mirror. They're using the mirror to see things on their bodies, parts of their bodies, the insides of their mouths. We've seen dolphins looking at their genital areas. Apes will do that. They're using it to look at themselves because in ways that they could never do that before. And it's fascinating to see that. And the fact that they use it as a tool to view themselves shows that they have this level of self-awareness. There are many different levels of awareness and self-awareness, but this is one that we thought was uniquely human, but it is not.
And that brings up an interesting point, tool use, because, I mean, we know that dolphins can use tools. You know, they can actually blow bubbles just for play. You know, they can actually emit not just a tool, a toy.
Yeah.
But here, they're using one of our tools as their own. So they're using our tools.
Yeah.
And I mean, you see that with apes too, of course, but it's just fascinating that they understand that that is a tool.
Yep. And we often don't think about it as that, but they're using it to see themselves. And the bubbles that you mentioned, I think we did the first paper showing bubble play in dolphins. And it was before we had YouTube videos. If you go on YouTube now, there are all of these videos of dolphins blowing bubbles and blowing bubble streams, these beautiful bubble rings. And what we found was that they'll force air out of their blowhole. They'll go to the bottom of the pool. Often you see them just free swimming and doing it. They blow air out of their blowhole at the top of their head, and then it creates a torus, a beautiful, what looks to be a silver ring. And these animals know how to manipulate these rings. If we tried to do it, we'd probably just break a bubble of air. If you touch it, it breaks. But they will actually spit water at it, and it doesn't break it. They're kind of physicists in their own right. They know how to manipulate air in the water. It's astonishing. And they can actually break them into two. So they've figured out how to manipulate a single ring, and it will break into two. In fact, when we first recorded them doing this, one dolphin we were watching, Shiloh, would repeatedly go to the bottom of the pool and sort of pop her head up, blow a ring up, and then what we saw was she looked up and it blew another ring. Its velocity was quicker than the first ring, which grew in circumference. When the second ring met the first ring, it formed a hoop-sized ring, and she swam through it. So these are the kinds of things you learn from these animals, what their capabilities are. These are untrained.
And just to hammer this home, all right, so blowing water, water jet is tool use, right? You're manipulating your environment and you're using that. But in this case, the dolphin is using it to do a physics experiment, to manipulate a ring of air that is already manipulated. Mm-hmm. That would be difficult for a human to even be able to do anything with, as you said, whereas these dolphins just gracefully play. And it's true play. This is, there's no debate that this, because you can do that with some animals. Is this play? Is this not play? The octopus being an example of that, although it does appear that what it does is play.
Yeah.
In this case, that dolphin is playing. and presumably having fun, which is my next question for you. Stress with dolphins is a real problem, especially when you capture them from the wild, and we're getting into that territory now. You knew I would. And how do you know that a dolphin is in good shape, well-being, happy, enjoying itself, or if it's just very stressed and in danger?
Yeah, well, if you're working with them when they're in the care of humans, they get medical exams, and it depends on the places. There are good places that care for animals very well, and there are places that are terrible. So let me say that first. I've worked in a number of places where in my lab in particular, I'm not there anymore, but where we did medical checkups, they were actually trained to participate in their care, much like, sometimes we can't even do this with our own children. We had trained them, if we needed blood samples to check, they would present their tail flukes, and we could take this in a way that they seemed quite calm. I had actually trained the dolphins to give fecal samples and urine samples, and we also had them trained that if we tapped their blowhole, we could check their breath and look for any kind of, infection. They also were trained, believe it or not, to take a tube to be intubated so we could check to see if any of them were stressed and had ulcers. And that's really unbelievable if you can do that. But more and more facilities are doing it. People who worked with dolphins in the beginning, the people who were working with cetaceans actually were doing that before they did it with other species in zoos. And then it's in many zoos now, they're working to train the animals to be relaxed when they do these so they don't have to dart them and they can actually participate. In the wild, it's a very different situation. So one of the questions is, can you tell from their behavior if they're stressed? Yeah, animals can show what we call stereotypic behaviors in captivity, and you can also see them as stereotypic behaviors in the wild. It's harder to see them in the wild, but these are repeated behaviors that, like pacing, head shaking, and different kinds of behaviors. Head banging can be a behavior sometimes you see with some species, and that suggests that it's either a coping mechanism to reduce anxiety or stress, or it's just showing that they're stressed. Now, you mentioned the wild, and we can bringing up a situation where there are places, as much as we know these animals need protection, and scientists keep speaking out about protecting these animals because they are aware, they're socially aware, they're self-aware, they can feel pain and suffering, as do many other animals. You don't have to just show mere self-recognition to need protection. Dogs should be protected as well, and they don't show mere self-recognition. But I'm going to focus on dolphins because they do show these, and these are the animals I study. There are places in the world where these animals are brutally slaughtered. And John, you mentioned, I think you've already talked about the Cove a bit. You mentioned this.
Now, there is documentary from over a decade now ago that you worked on, and I watched back then and was appalled, called The Cove. And it's about the city of Taiji in Japan, which is one of several places worldwide. There are other places that aren't in Japan where dolphins are getting slaughtered. To this day, what is an update on that? Is the situation regarding needlessly killing dolphins? I mean, some of the excuses for it were unbelievable, like they were eating too many fish, like that even makes sense, and things like that. Has that improved since the making of that documentary, or are we still in bad shape as far as people slaughtering and capturing? And I want to make that distinction here too. It's not just slaughtering for food, it's capturing them for a market for less than scrupulous displays, animal displays, sea parks, things like that. So what's the situation on that today?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So first, just to be transparent about this. So before the film, The Cove, after we did the mirror study, I became aware of the fact that they were still doing these what are called drive hunts in Japan. It used to be in Futo, and the population of dolphins diminished so much they stopped after they were doing this, and they moved this activity to Taiji. And when I found out it was still going on, I said, I'm going to do something. I got to do something about this. And I was working at the Wildlife Conservation Society at the time. They had a whole international program as well as the zoos in New York. And I just said, we all should gather together and make sure that we do something about this. So we started something called Act for Dolphins, okay? And we brought in all the zoological institutions in the United States and from the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. We went to our Marine Mammal Society, which is the International Society for Marine Mammalogy, people who study whales and dolphins. And we got a big petition and saying all of these groups are against this because we know these animals need protection. This is horrendous and it needs to be stopped. And my colleague who I did the mirror study with, a woman named Lori Marino, Dr. Marino, and I led this charge with the Wildlife Conservation Society at the time. And we had thousands of people supporting this. I actually went to the Embassy of Japan in DC, to present the case for protecting these animals and bringing this to an end. That didn't stop. We just couldn't break through. We could barely get the press to cover this. It was very hard to get coverage on this because it was such a horrific situation. I met the person who made the cove, whose name is Luis Sahoyas, the director of the cove. He was at a marine mammal conference, and he was sent to me because he was making a film, and I told him about the situation, and he called me a couple of weeks later, and he said, "Diana, we're going to go to Japan. We're making this film." And I became a science advisor for the film. What occurred was that the way the film was made, it had all good intentions. It's an amazing film, but I think in the end, it just made the Japanese government dig their heels in deeper, and it did not help. And I think perhaps what needed to happen is in a film is to give the Japanese government and people a way to save face. I think it was perhaps too harsh for them to respond in a way that we needed them to respond. I think, and we know that we have to work within the government more and get people in Japan trying to make change. And there are many people in Japan who want to bring this to an end, who think this is horrible, but it's a very difficult situation. And there really needs to be more of a public outcry and ramifications.
And that's why I brought it up. You got to bring attention to it. And I personally disagree with even capturing these from the wild. Now, of course, something born in captivity is a different story, but capturing from the wild, I disagree with that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And for a long time, we've all been saying no more captures from the wild. And in the United States, they stopped capturing dolphins. Probably now it's been about 30 years. And there's been more and more of a move not to be at least in aquaria, in concrete pools, not to be doing more captive, to limit breeding in captivity. And perhaps if there are many animals that you just cannot release because they've been born in captivity. And perhaps an alternative would be to have seaside sanctuaries, open sea facilities. That's the kind of place I'm working in now. And I'm hoping eventually that that's where we go for the future. I think it's, where you can still care for the animals, those that need to be cared for, but absolutely animals should not be taken from the wild. And we need to protect their habitats so they have healthy habitats to live in as well. So it's protecting them and their habitat.
The fun thing about the open sea sanctuary type thing is that, the dolphins, if they're in their free environment and they're doing okay and they're curious, they'll come and interact with you.
Yep.
And they'll come and talk to you. So it's not like the dolphins are going away. It's just that you get to see them how they really are. My one last question in this grain, and then I got one other. But this first one is, do we still classify with things like the whaling industry? Do we still classify a distinction between small cetaceans and large ones? Because I know the whales got some protection because of public outcry back, in the 1980s and onward. But the small cetaceans were not protected under those rules. Has that changed or gotten better?
I think we still need much more protection for small cetaceans. I'm glad you're asking that. In the International Whaling Commission, the IWC, has a group for small cetaceans, but they're not nearly as protected as the larger ones. There are obviously animals that are listed as endangered populations or threatened. I'm personally now working with, this is going to sound strange, Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. Sea Shepherd used to be considered not very science-based. And many years ago, they're focusing on saving the most endangered of all cetaceans, the little vaquita in the Gulf of Mexico. And my close friend and colleague, Roger Payne, who I mentioned before, who discovered humpback whale song. He sadly passed away a few years ago now, came to me and said, I'm working with Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. I think they have a way to save the vaquita. I need you to join us on the board of directors. And I have joined the board, and we are working with the Mexican government now to protect these highly endangered species. There were, at one point, there were 12 left. That's nearly extinct. Yet with protection where fishing boats cannot get into this zero tolerance zone, which has now been established, with really good monitoring by Sea Shepherd and the Mexican government in partnership, we have hope. And Sea Shepherd is working, again, with the government of Mexico. The Mexican government didn't have the resources to do 24/7 monitoring. And I'm proud to say that Sea Shepherd is. They have drones doing surveillance. They're always there in this basic mothership. And if we can keep the fishing nets out of these areas, we have hope. 2 years ago, the census, where they could see the animals, showed that there was growth, slight growth, but growth for the first time in the population, this very small population. And you might wonder, is there not genetic diversity? And studies have shown, yes, in this group there is. So we're all very hopeful.
Now, my final question is back to SETI, because that's my wheelhouse. And I explained off air, was that I'm fascinated with alien life. But when we ever, if ever, we find alien signals, radio signals or something like that, we need to decode them. We're going to need you folks. So my question is what does learning animal communication teach us about the frame of thinking we need to be thinking about should we ever have to try and understand an alien signal? And in that same grain, do you think we will ever be able to talk to a dolphin?
Okay.
As in real language, and understand those clicks and sounds they make?
Well, that's the work my colleagues and I are doing right now, trying to decipher, decode. And again, I've been working with these guys for over 40 years. But now we have some really good tools. We have tools for AI. We're coming up with better and better ways of recording them when we can be invisible, watching them from drones, where we're overhead, not visible to them, and we can record their signals as well. We even have them mic'd individually with little tiny suction cup devices, so we can say who's saying what and when. We're in the beginnings of these studies. So I'm very hopeful about this. But getting back to, because, it sounds like it's very doable to say, well, we can record this, that, and the other thing. But again, when we don't know the basis for how something is encoded, what are the nature of the signals? What's the structure of their communication? What's the content for dolphins? How different might it be? Interestingly, we've gotten glimmers from some of the keyboard work that I mentioned earlier in terms of structure, because in that study and another study of their own communication, we're starting to think that it's combinatorial in nature, that we might look for smaller units within the larger units. And we've gotten that from dolphins themselves. When we've given them smaller units to manipulate, they've combined them. So we've seen that in this paper we published back in 1993, we showed that dolphins, when they were using the keyboard, would use the ball signal when they were playing with the ball. They would use the ring signal when they were playing with the ring. Not always, but then they started combining the ball and ring signal into one continuous whistle during a game they invented where they were playing with them together. So we have some other evidence now that's not published yet of combinatorial sequencing, of combined. So now we have some ideas how to look. What it's about, we have to be really, not just looking for what we know. And that's really a challenge because, we're blinded. We look through our human filters. And this gets into extraterrestrial encounters too. If we ever find another signal, or if we ever find the opportunity to have a face to, maybe it's not even what we call a face encounter. What do we do? And I keep coming back to close encounters of the third kind. You match them, you imitate. As soon as you can find a way to imitate a signal that another has done, you're acknowledging that they've been seen, they've been perceived. What you do and how you do it can let them know even about your sensory perceptions. If somebody is waving and you're not waving back, you may not have the senses to wave. If you can wave back and they can perceive that, that's telling you a lot. So when we work with dolphins and you give them a signal and you see, do they even imitate it? Do they use it back with you, which they were in our case? And what aspects of it are they using and how are they embedding those signals in their own repertoire? I think that's a foot in the door to trying to work with other forms of intelligent life. And by the way, we're doing a study at Rockefeller University now with my colleague and my collaborator on the dolphin work as well, Marcelo Magnasco. We have an octopus lab. I think I mentioned that before. We have this octopus lab, and we're trying to look at the octopus, which is, I joke about this because I've been working with non-handed cetaceans, and now we're working with 8-armed octopuses. And that's equally challenging, even if not more challenging, because their behavior is so different. They're such a different life form, yet they show this strikingly intelligent behavior. And then you look at dolphins, and even though they're morphologically different, their bodies are so different than ours. Both the dolphins and octopuses have evolved in such different environments from us. Dolphins, I can actually relate to what I see them do. There are things that are very familiar in their behavior. In the octopus, it's very unfamiliar, but so challenging.
All right, Doctor, thank you for joining us here today. And the first thing I have to say is that, I think it'd be funny if the first SETI signal we get stops abruptly and says timeout.
I love that.
And then the second is that, I watched your presentation and the footage of Groucho Marx, and something tells me Groucho Marx, seeing the footage of your dolphins watching themselves in the mirror, I think he would have cracked a smile.
I hope so.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I look forward to the new paper, and I hope you'll come back and visit with us again when that comes out, because we didn't even scratch the surface of dolphins. And we didn't even get to the elephants.
Right. I'll keep you posted on that. We have 2 new ones coming out, so I'll let you know as soon as they're out.
Fantastic. Thank you.